I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Major General Jason Bohm, a Marine with over 30 years of service. An infantryman by trade, he's commanded at every level from platoon commander to commanding general in peacetime and war. General Bohm has served in key staff positions, including as a strategic planner with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, director of the Marine Corps Expeditionary Warfare School, House Director of the Marine Corps Office of Legislative Affairs at the U.S. House of Representatives, and Chief of Staff at the U.S. Naval Striking and Support Forces in NATO. General Bohm has a bachelor's degree in marketing, a master's in military studies, and a master's in national security studies as well. He's written several articles for the Marine Corps Gazette, won writing awards from the Marine Corps Association, and is the author of the book Washington's Marines, which describes the early days of the Marine Corps during the Revolutionary War. So, Jason, thank you for your career of service and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Tim. And if I could, let me start by just applauding you for your podcast because I've been very impressed with the wide variety of topics that you cover and the professionalism in which you approach it. So great job.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, sir. So our focus today is Washington's Marines, the origins of the Corps and the American Revolution, 1775 to 1777. I am definitely going to put links in the YouTube show notes. I want people to check out this book. You have done an amazing job with it. But before we get into it, I wanted to start by asking if you could share a little bit of your background with the audience and what inspired you to write this.
Sure. Well, thank you for asking. So, really my journey and a love for the Marine Corps and life of service began when I was in third grade. And it started when I went to my school library, and there was a book on the Civil War that the American Heritage puts out, and it amazed me. It just captured me, and it started my interest in the military. And the very next book I picked up was 30 Seconds Over Tokyo about the famous Doolittle raid in World War II. That really piqued my interest in the Pacific theater during World War II. And of course, who was romping and stomping across the Pacific in World War II but United States Marines? And so that's where I was really introduced to the Marine Corps. I am the first Marine in my family. And I just decided early on that that was the life for me. In fact, my mother still has a letter in her scrapbook that says, "Dear Jason, thank you for your interest in the Marine Corps, but seeing as though you're only 12 years old, we can't help you yet." And so the major that wrote to me very kindly recommended that I stay in school. So I listened to his advice. And, here I am all these years later.
Ah, okay. So my own grandfather was one of the first Marine. I'm not even sure if you would call it Marine aviators. He flew a cloth-winged aircraft in the Banana Wars and used to tell stories about, just bullets going right through the cloth, right, as he was flying over. So,
It's
uh,
just an incredible, rich history. So what a legacy for you to be able to continue to share with others.
well, the Marine Corps has so many remarkable stories. I mean, Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon being awarded the Mameluke Sword in the First Barbary War. They made a movie about that. The
Hmm.
Marines' use of cloth-winged aircraft, as I mentioned, Chesty Puller's remarkable heroism at the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea. And of course, I think everyone knows about the Marines planting the flag on Iwo Jima in the Pacific Theater, as you mentioned. So, with all of those stories and this incredibly rich history to draw from, what took you back to the Revolutionary War as a focus?
Hmm. That's another great question. So really, if you know Marines as you do, you know that our history and our tradition and our legacies are extremely important to us. We instill that in every Marine in the Marine Corps. It becomes an ethos of part of who we are. And the reason for that is because we understand that that becomes a force multiplier on the battlefield. We refuse to fail because we refuse to let those Marines that went before us down. And that's extremely powerful. So, as part of my own self study and my own journey in learning more about Marine Corps history, I determined that there was a void in my understanding of the origins of the Corps. All Marines know the name Samuel Nicholas as the first Marine, and they know about Tun Tavern, where we were born, but they really know the myths that have been created over the years and not the reality of the story of what really happened at that time. So there's just a incredibly rich story to be told there. And as I learned it myself, I wanted to share that story with all Marines and more importantly, with a broader audience. Because the Marine Corps story is only part of a much larger story that includes our brothers from the Army and the Navy and the creation of the nation. So I encapsulate and tell the parallel stories of all those organizations in our great country in Washington's Marines.
Well, and that's definitely something I want to return to in a few minutes because, yeah, again, you've really expanded on the role of the Marine Corps and again how they worked with George Washington during the Revolutionary War, and it's a much more expansive story than just the Corps itself. But from what I understand, the Marines trace their historical lineage back to the British Royal Marines. So those were established in London in 1664. But then, as you mentioned, the U.S. Marine Corps is known as being established at Tun Tavern in Philadelphia in 1775. So at that time, if I understand correctly, the role of the Marines was still primarily as marksmen on board ships, right?
Well, sure, but there were many other roles and responsibilities that Marines had at that time. But they were created to serve with the fleet, and they served several important roles on board the ships, as we use the Royal Navy as the model for creating the Continental Marines. First and foremost, Marines were responsible for the good order and discipline on the ships. And as such, they also protected the captains from mutinous crews, which would occur from time to time. And so the captains kept their Marines very close by. As you stated, they would shoot down on enemy ships from the fighting masts and the riggings of the ships in order to repel enemy boarders or to create boarding parties to board enemy ships and capture those ships. In addition to that, they would create landing parties to conduct limited operations ashore in support of larger naval campaigns. And then ultimately, the Congress was very wise in writing it into law that the Marines could fight on sea and land. And that is one of the caveats that was used to later have the Continental Marines come off of their ships, detached from the Navy, and attached to the Army in support of George Washington. And the law allowed for that, and the circumstances at this critical time in the American Revolution called for it.
Ah, well, so going back to Tun Tavern, I did a little bit of research on this. I learned some new things.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was Tun Tavern reportedly had the best beer in Philadelphia, just to put that out there,
Yeah, I'm
even though
not sure
it's
where you heard that, but it's probably true. Yeah.
So in addition to being the birthplace of the Marine Corps, it was also a regular meeting place for city and colonial officials. And that was, I'd never read that before. Apparently, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington held a Continental Congress there, and John Adams and the first Naval Committee met there. And then, thanks to Ben Franklin, it is also considered the official birthplace of Freemasonry in America. I believe there are something like 2.3 million Freemasons in the United States, and they all consider Tun Tavern their birthplace as well as the Marine Corps. So, I mean, this is just an absolute legendary part of Marine Corps history, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And you hit at the reality and not the myth of Tun Tavern when it comes to being the birthplace of the Marine Corps. That what makes it the official birthplace of the Marine Corps is the fact that the Naval Committee in 1775, November of 1775 to be specific, which at that time only consisted of three members of Congress: John Adams from Massachusetts, Silas Deane from Connecticut, and John Langdon from New Hampshire. They were tasked with creating a course of action to address a correspondence that was received in the Congress from the Committee of Safety from Passamaquoddy, Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia at that time housed Halifax, which was the principal Royal Navy base in the American theater for the British. The people of Passamaquoddy did not agree with British rule. And so they wrote to the Congress requesting to become part of the Association of North Americans fighting the motherland for their independence. So the Naval Committee of Three met in the second story room of Tun Tavern and created a plan to conduct a naval operation to capture Halifax And in doing so, they identified the need for forming 2 battalions of Marines. So they briefed their plan on the 9th of November to the full Congress. And on the 10th of November, the Congress resolved to create these 2 battalions of Marines, hence the birth of the United States Marine Corps, what would become the United States Marine Corps, Continental Marines at the time.
Ah, okay. Well, so going to the book jacket a little bit of Washington's Marines, and again, I want to get everyone to get a copy of this. There's a link in the YouTube show notes. You'd written, as General Washington struggled to preserve his command after defeats in New York and New Jersey in 1776, the nascent Navy and Marines deployed the first American fleet, conducted their first amphibious operation, and waged a war on the rivers and the seas to block British reinforcements and capture critically needed supplies. So I think as Americans, we're all very familiar with the setbacks and challenges and successes encountered by the Army. But in contrast, do you think that the Navy was more successful overall, or did they have many of the same struggles?
I would not call them more successful. In fact, you could probably argue they were less successful than the Continental Army, and in great part because they faced many of the same challenges as Washington and the Continental Army. First and foremost, as you know, when the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps were formed, we still did not have a United States of America. We were still 13 independent colonies. The first and second Continental Congress had met, but it wasn't until the following year that they signed the Declaration of Independence and became an independent nation. And when they did, they struggled with being able to stand up this country. One of the critical tasks that they had to do was start to generate revenue. But they did not have the ability to tax the colonies or the future states at first, which meant there was no revenue to be able to pay soldiers, sailors, or Marine salaries. And more critically, for the Navy, they didn't have any ships, and ships are expensive. And we didn't have shipyards that were in a position to be able to build large men of war vessels. So what the Navy did at first was they converted merchant ships into warships by adding cannons onto ships that traditionally only carried cargo. So the first fleet only consisted of 5 converted merchant ships. And so they were challenged first by not having the revenue to be able to do that. Secondly, they had to find ships. And then third, they had to find the people to man the ships. But they were challenged in both of those areas because there was a very lucrative privateer industry going on at the time. Because the nation did not have a navy, the Congress sanctioned privateers, which in essence are sanctioned pirates, legal pirates, to be able and go out and capture British ships to block reinforcements and resupply coming from England to reinforce the British troops in America. And the situation there was that private owners of these vessels would get letters of marque from the Congress, and when they captured the ships, they would sell them for prize money and the items in the ships for prize money that got split between the crew. So the crews of privateers and the captains of privateers made far more money than the very low pay received by continental sailors, Marines, or even soldiers. And so most of the ships that were being built were being pulled in to be privateers, which was much more profitable, meaning there were less ships available for the Continental Navy to stand up a fleet. And then the sailors that they would enlist to be able to serve on those ships were more interested in making money as privateers than they were as serving a rough and sacrificial life of sailors or Marines on board these continental vessels. So it wasn't all about money. Obviously, the great cause that many Americans were fighting for drew many of them to still honorably serve as Marine sailors and soldiers throughout the war. So I don't want to misrepresent the great Americans and our forefathers and what they did.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that in this book, one of the big questions for me that I've always wondered about that you answer is why they fight on land like the Army, why the Marines fight on land. And so, as I understand, you describe this in detail, and it involves George Washington using them as reinforcements for the Army. right?
Yes, absolutely. So, starting in August of 1776, George Washington started the New York campaign with 19,000, we'll call them neophyte troops. It was newly formed Continental soldiers, which were primarily subsumed from the Minutemen that responded after Lexington and Concord. They were New England militiamen predominantly that were formed into regular Continental regiments and brigades. The first recruited soldiers were from Maryland and Virginia and Pennsylvania, and they were riflemen and rifle companies. But unless you were a veteran of the French and Indian War or had fought in either Lexington, Concord, or uh, Bunker Hill at this point, many of them have never even heard a weapon fired in anger. Compare that to what showed up on their doorstep. 32,000 professional Royal soldiers, as you were, British soldiers, Royal Marines, and Hessian mercenaries. 2,000 Royal Marines, 32,000 troops, hundreds of British ships, and manning over 1,200 cannons. So from August of 76 all the way through December of 76, uh, General Washington was challenged to fight the New York and New Jersey campaigns, which didn't end until December 8th, after he had been defeated several times in New York, retreated across New Jersey, and crossed into Pennsylvania across the Delaware River. And it was that natural boundary that prevented General Howe from basically completing the defeat of Washington. But when he crossed the river on December 8th, that 19,000 had dwindled down with Washington a force of only 2,500. And there were people that were deserting rapidly. There was disease among the troops. They had sustained several casualties, and they were getting ready to face several hundred more terminating enlistments, which meant that 2,500 was going to dwindle down even further. So it was a dire need that Washington needed reinforcements, and he called the Continental Congress and asked for support. And the Congress had very little to offer, but there were two principal units that were available. One was a group of Pennsylvania militiamen called the Associators under a gentleman named John Cadwalder, and the other was the Continental Marines. Inside of Philadelphia at that time, there were 4 of the 13 original frigates that the Congress had authorized to be constructed back a year earlier. And Samuel Nicholas, the first Marine and senior Marine, was tasked with establishing 4 companies of Marines to man each of those 4 ships as Marine detachments. When Washington requested assistance, he took 3 of those company of Marines and formed a battalion of Marines, leaving one back on the Randolph, which was getting ready to put to sea. And he took that battalion of Marines up the Delaware River and linked up with Washington at Trenton on the 8th of December. Washington was unsure whether they were meant to fight on land or on the water, because the Pennsylvania Navy and Continental Navy was operating on the Delaware River and controlled the river at the time, and there were state Marines and privateer Marines that were serving as well. So he assigned John Cadwalder in charge of the Associators to take command of the Marines that would serve as a separate and distinct battalion underneath the Associator Brigade.
Well, to me, the Marine Corps seems like one of the most adaptable branches of the U.S. military, and what you're describing just further highlights that. I mean, the Marines provide security at embassies, naval bases, vessels, honor guard details for dignitaries. Marines provide combat air support and land forces in both land and naval engagements around the globe. Did the early days of the Corps that you've written about set a precedent for this diversity of roles?
I think it absolutely did. And it goes back to the resolution that the Congress enacted, which stated specifically that Marines would fight on the sea and the land, which at that time were the 2 domains of war. Since then, and as you stated, your grandfather served as a naval aviator. So once airplanes came into service, The Marines' role expanded to include the air, land, and sea. And even today, the domains of war have been expanded to include cyberspace, space, and information. And so the Marines today engage in all of those domains of war. But that all started back in 1775 with the initial resolution that created the Marines.
Well, so one of the things that most people aren't necessarily aware of is not only do the Marines serve this incredibly wide and diverse variety of roles around the globe, but they do it typically with much less funding than the other branches of the service. So one of the things that I was wondering was, as the complexity and technological requirements of modern warfighting continue to increase, do you think that budgets will become more of a challenge for the Marine Corps?
Well, I would argue that budgets have been a challenge for the Marine Corps and all the services since we were created during the American Revolution. And that's even more so today because the defense industry is very powerful and things cost an awful lot of money today. Emerging technologies are bringing incredible capability to the battlefield today, but it comes at a very high cost. And a little bit of modern day Marine Corps, our current commandant in 2019 took the Marine Corps in a new direction based off of the guidance and direction that we received from the National Defense Strategy. And I would argue the last time that America faced an existential threat was the Soviet Union in 1989. Up until that time, Marines had been doing countless full spectrum operations short of war. But we haven't had to prepare for a peer competitor in a full conventional war since the Soviet Union until now, because now we have been identified as having China as our pacing threat to prepare for a potential war with them. We hope we don't ever have to go to war with China, but if we have to, we first want to be a strong deterrent. And short of that deterrence, we need to win. And the tools that we're building in order to defeat China in a future war cost an awful lot of money. And so, in order to compensate for a limited budget, our commandant made the decision to divest of a lot of legacy platforms that existed in the Marine Corps and structure that existed in the Marine Corps in order to demonstrate to the Congress that we are good stewards of the limited dollars that we get. And so we actually saved $8 billion by divesting of equipment and immediately reinvested that money into the capabilities like sensors, like drones, like unmanned systems, and like long range precision fires that will allow us to win in future wars.
Well, actually, that was one of the I was gonna ask about drones next because that currently in Ukraine, I think that's showcasing just the transformative nature of drones in modern warfare. And I think technology in general has provided a lot of disruptive as well as transformative, capabilities. One thing that comes to mind was mobile phones being used to call in airstrikes during the Iraq War, right? They were a backup when communications was out. People were actually using cell phones to call in airstrikes, and it was successful, and it demonstrates the flexibility of this technology. Um, do you think that makes the Marines potentially even more effective than in the past, having access to this wide, diverse collection of technologies they can draw from?
It absolutely does. It will make us more lethal without a doubt. The challenge is that we are now able to put more capable and more lethal systems into more junior Marines' hands. And we have to do that as well, because we have a saying in the Corps, if we can see you, we can kill you. And with the emergent technology that exists today and the proliferation of low cost sensors and drones, it's very easy to find people on the battlefield today. And so we understand that capability exists. We are actually, for the first time in our history, the Marine Corps just acquired two Group 5 UAVs, and we're getting more. And in fact, we're going to put drones in the hands of every squad. That's a young staff sergeant that's going to be leading a group of 14 Marines. Every one of them is going to have their own drone to see over the next hill. to be able to use. But we understand that if we're going to bring this new technology into the Marine Corps, we need to build a more capable, a more mature, and a more resilient Marine, because the capability that used to require authorities at my level as a general officer to be able to release a weapon system, for example, is now going to be pushed down to a much more junior level. And the reason for that is, if we can see you, we can kill you means we don't want to mass our formations any longer. We want to be able to disperse and operate in a dispersed environment in order to make it tougher for the enemy to target us. And if we're going to do that across a wide expansive area, that requires our ability to be able to communicate with people. But we are making an assumption that our communications are going to be effectively jammed by the enemy, which means we have to have flexible, adaptable problem solvers on the ground who can operate independently with a mission, an intent, and the capability and the knowledge on how to use it that we have given to them. And so that's taken all of this holistic approach to be able to succeed on future battlefields.
Ah, well, that dovetails actually into my next question perfectly. And I should probably tread lightly on this because the other branches will probably not be happy. But the Army, Navy, and Air Force recruit heavily based on the GI Bill and tactical training. And that's something that I've seen over a long period of time. And they often struggle to meet their recruiting goals. The Marines recruit on honor, courage, and commitment. I mean, I think probably the most famous was "We Never Promised You a Rose Garden," right? And
Yes.
traditionally, the Marines are the only branch that never fails in its recruiting goals. So, do you think that the other branches can learn a lesson from this?
Well, I think that each branch of service has its own unique culture. And so what you hit on is the fact that the Marine Corps has a very successful culture. Our brand is that we are warfighters. We are flexible, adaptable warfighters. We're men and women of character and honor who succeed in everything that we do. So that attracts a certain type of young man and woman to want to be part of our team. And in the Marine Corps, we don't give anything away for free. You know this. You have to earn it. You earn the title and you earn everything you get in the Marine Corps. But what it comes down to is the approach to recruiting. And the unique approach that the Marine Corps has is we don't start out by telling you what we have to offer you. We don't start out by saying, hey, we have $50,000 for college, Tim. How does that sound? Because you may not want to go to college, or you may not need money to go to college. So what we do is we identify to young men and women that the Marine Corps has tangible and intangible benefits. The tangible benefits are the ones that you mentioned that the other services start with. Yes, we have all the same bonuses and can pay for college and paid vacation and all of that. But then more importantly, and what attracts most people to the Marine Corps are the intangibles. It's what you said. It's honor, courage, commitment, travel and adventure, sense of belonging, semper fidelis, always faithful to God, country, and Corps. And what we do is we will sit down with a young man or woman and we will ask them first, what's important to you? Because what's important to you is important to me. And then once I know whether you lean more towards tangible or intangible benefits, I'm going to demonstrate to you how the Marine Corps can meet those objectives you have for your personal and professional life. And so it's us investing in them. And I'll give you one other example. Truth in advertising, my last assignment was I was the Commander General of Marine Corps Recruitment Command. So I know a little bit about this, and I can tell you I'm incredibly proud of our Marine recruiters. We were the only service to make mission fully last year. We achieved the highest diversity mission and the highest female assessor mission in our 247 years of service to our nation. And we are going to make mission again this year. And unfortunately, we will be the only service to make mission this year as well. Real challenges out there, and I really do applaud all the services and the great work they're doing for our country out there. But the way I put it to a young man or woman who's trying to shop between the services, I'll say, well, let me play a word association game. And I'll start out and I'll say, I'm going to say a word, and I want you to blurt out the first image that comes to your mind when I say it. Are you ready? and I'll say Air Force, and most people say planes. I'll say Navy, and they say ships. I'll say Army, and they say tanks or artillery. And then I'll say, are you ready for it? Marine Corps. And the first image that people get in their mind is the picture of a Marine, usually in dress blues. And I'll say, so what's the difference? The difference is the priority effort, the most precious asset that we have in a Marine Corps is a living, breathing human being. It's a person, not an inanimate hunk of metal. The Marine Corps invests in its people because we need them to be that flexible, adaptable problem solver who's going to be conducting independent operations out there on the battlefield. And they will succeed because we work hard to never fail and live up to that legacy that started with the Continental Marines back in 1775.
Well, Jason, on that note, let me thank you so much for your time today, as well as your remarkable career of service. I'd like to close with this question. The same branch of the U.S. military that fought so fiercely that the Nazis called them devil dogs spends time handing out toys to less fortunate children around the country every Christmas. In the 248 years since those humble origins in Tun's Tavern, has the Marine Corps become a modern representation of chivalry in today's world? And what do you think Washington would say if he could see the Corps now?
Well, I think we've always been a chivalrous service through our inception. And yes, so the way I would define it is we are men and women of character. And I define that as we do nothing illegal, immoral, and unethical. And as you stated, Marines, and I've served with Marines in combat, I've served with Marines in humanitarian missions. They are the fiercest fighters in the world, but they are also the most compassionate people I know. And it's that very delicate balance and being able to switch it on and off in both directions. If George Washington saw us today, I think he would be proud of his Marines, but I also think that he would be leaning towards trying to get more of that defense budget for the Army because they're in need of building modern capabilities as well. And there's been several presidents in our past that have served in the Army that haven't been very big fans of the Marines because they think we get too much notoriety and all the other services can do everything that Marines already do, and they think they could do it better than us. But it's that holistic approach that we take in fighting across all the domains of warfare. And it's that special ethos of being a Marine. Every Marine is a rifleman, first and foremost. That flexible, adaptable problem solver that can get it done.
Sir, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Tim. It's been my pleasure. God bless you all and Semper Fidelis.